Okay, ready? We do this already. Today's shir is sponsored, what do you say? Yeah. Ilu Nishmas Pinchas David ben Avram, and as a schus for Refuah Shalema for Shmuel Melech ben Rivka. Okay. Last week we spoke about some of the various more outlandish theories of the origin of Ethiopian Jews, the myth of Ethiopian origin, B'chlal, who the whole country thinks they are, and how their Jews may have come to think who they are. Now, this week I want to talk about a little bit more the teeth of the halachic discussion, of like the actual fight between the Psakim about the status of Ethiopian Jews. But even before that, I just want to talk about one of the more, let's call it mainstream versions of how the Ethiopian Jews came to be. Now, I just want to be mocked them like this. If you will stop a sociologist, someone who studies people, a secular sociologist, and ask him, are the Jews from Ethiopia Jews, and how did they land there? The answer you will most likely be given is no, they are not Jews, and they decided that they were Jewish a few hundred years ago. 500-600 years ago, or maybe a little longer, they decided that they're Jewish, and they don't have any real origin story or proof to their Judaism. Now, keep that in mind, because that's going to play a role in some of the Pskim's discussion. But if you were to ask a sociologist, that's what he would tell you. Additionally, there's so what is the story that's the most likely one that they believe? So now, there's a Rav who worked for the Rabbanut. His name is Reb Menachem Waldman. He wrote 5 or 7 svarim on the sugya of Ethiopian Jews. He's the main collector of data and information and Pskim. Half of the chuvas from the Pskim, like the Gedolei Pskim who wrote about this matter, are addressed to him. Like he's the one who did this work. Now, granted, he's on the team that holds that they're Jews in good standing and whatever, and we'll put that aside. But he, in 1984, when the first few thousand Ethiopian Jews showed up to Eretz Yisrael, before they did the airlift and they brought many thousands more, he made a conference where he gathered together 12 of their chachamim. Now, Ethiopian chacham is called a kas. It's kof samach. Maybe I'm pronouncing it wrong. He gathered together all the kasim, all the different chachamim of the Ethiopians, and he did similar to what the Gemara Megillah tells us Talmai HaMelech did. He sat them each in their own cubicle. He gave them a blank piece of paper with a pen, and he said, do me a favor. If you can, fill out this questionnaire. And he gave them a questionnaire with several different questions that he wanted to know. Now, question 7, I think, on the questionnaire was, what is your origin story? How did you Jews end up over here? How did you get from point A, being Eretz Yisrael with the rest of Klal Yisrael, to point B, being in Ethiopia in your tribe? And I think there was 12 different Kasim who were at this get-together. And would it surprise you if I said that there was at least 12 stories about how they got there? Meaning there was no consensus on how they got there. They all had a little bit of a different narrative. Some of them knew more about it. Some of them knew less about it. Some of it had a bigger arichos. Some of it were much more mekatzer. Now, from amongst these different, kasim and the reasons that they gave, there did emerge one primary theory that several of them, in one tzura or another, said, and that was that they came from Egypt. Now, what they said is as follows, and this is where it gets a little sticky, is each one had their own version of this. But the Jewish community in Egypt, the original Jewish community in Egypt, starts when Klal Yisrael goes down to Mitzrayim. But after that, we take a long break. And the pasuk even says not to go back to Mitzrayim, right? We take a long break. Now after that, call it the more modern Kehillah of Egypt, starts by Yirmiyahu Hanavi. Yirmiyahu Hanavi, after the Churban HaBayis Rishon, after the Bayis Rishon is Nachrav, and after Gedaliah ben Achikam is killed on Gimel Tishrei, which is the same Gedaliah, Yirmiyahu Hanavi goes down to Mitzrayim with a bunch of other Jews and sets up a Kehillah over there. Now, eventually, the Bayis Sheni is built, and most Jews come back to Eretz Yisrael. I shouldn't say most. A bunch of Jews come back to Eretz Yisrael, but not everyone comes back to Eretz Yisrael. And there remains a Kehillah in Egypt throughout the whole Bayis Sheni. Now, during the Bayis Sheni, Egypt itself, just like Eretz Yisrael, undergoes a big tkufa of changes in power, who's in charge. There's a tkufa when the Egyptians are in charge. Then there's a tkufa when the Greeks take over. Then there's a tkufa when the Romans take over. And during each one of these different tkufas, different Jews live in Egypt. Now, Lamashal, we know, the Gemara tells us of several different schisms that took place in the kings of the Chashmonaim. Meaning during the Chashmonaim Tkufa, which is the Greek Tkufa of Klal Yisrael, there was many different schisms. Now, one of them is the famous one that the Gemara Menachos Naf Kuftas tells us about Chanyai. Basically, the Gemara tells us that Shimon HaTzadik had 2 children, and there was a big fight over who's going to take over, who's going to be the Kohen Gadol after Shimon HaTzadik. And it's a shtalshus how it happens, but ultimately Chanyai, one of Shimon HaTzadik's children, migrates down to Mitzrayim, where he makes himself a mikdash over there in Mitzrayim as well. And he brings karbanos over there. And it's interesting is that Chazal in the Gemara in Menachos are a little bit ambivalent towards the mikdash chanya. They feel like mitzad echad, he had like Shem Shemayim, he did it l'shma. They were brought as karbanos l'Shem Shemayim. They were not brought as karbanos l'Shem and Avodah Zarah. Mitzad sheni, it was a bama. When you're not allowed to have a bama, it was a different Beis HaMikdash. When you're not allowed to have a different Beis HaMikdash. So there's like a little bit mixed feelings. The Gemara in Megillah and Daf Yud brings a little bit of a different nusach of the Beis Chanya, and maybe the Kohanim who served in the Beis Chanya can't work anywhere else. But there was a very sizable kehila in Mitzrayim in that Tkufa during the Beis Chanya Tkufa. Now we also know that there's the Alexandria Shal Mitzrayim. The kehila of Alexandria in Egypt had a big kehila. The Gemara talks about that several times, about the paddle that they used to use to get the whole tzibur to follow along. So we know there was big kehilas in Egypt at different times. Now additionally, in Yosefin, in like the Stam history of Klal Yisrael, it's brought down that at a certain period, the Egyptian kings hired Jewish mercenaries to be the border guard. The border guard of Egypt, to defend the external borders of Egypt, was Jewish mercenaries. Now, so there was a Jewish kehillah that lived there. Now, based on all these different time frames, in these range, if you want to start from when Yirmiyahu Hanavi goes down to Mitzrayim until the end, these last stories, which are during the Churban Abayis, is like a tkufa of 600-700 years of different tkufas that there was kehillas in Mitzrayim. Now, eventually, when the Beis HaMikdash is destroyed in the Roman tkufa, the Romans also instruct the kehillah in Egypt to be destroyed, and they destroy that as well. So it's like a 700-year period that there's this big kehillah in Eretz Yisrael. Now, if you looked at all these documents from all these different kasim, a lot of them say we went down with Yirmiyahu, and then eventually we migrated down to Ethiopia. We went down the Nile River, and we migrated to Ethiopia. Or we went down with the warlords, and we migrated down to Ethiopia. We went down with Chanya, and like a lot of the different versions, they start their story. We started in Egypt. We started at some point in Egypt, and then eventually we migrated down. Now, what they're claiming is that if you look at a map, you could look at this, you'll see the Nile River goes down and then it splits. There's a blue Nile and a white Nile. They're claiming that at some point they hopped on a boat and went down the Nile, which is a hard to believe story because the Nile is a very, very strong and powerful river, especially in certain parts of it. It's very rapidy, it has a lot of rapids, it narrows in certain places, but they have a whole story, and this is the different versions that they said. Now, so how did they end up looking so different from the rest of the Jews, if they're Jews who came from Eretz Yisrael? So they say, obviously, that when they did this migration, they were only men on the boat. It was warrior men who could do it. They got there, and eventually when they set up camp and they had a place to live, they had to take women from the locals, and they were Megayer all these local women. They married these local women, and that's how over time they came to look like the locals of wherever they set up shop. But Ba'atzim, they're Jews in good standing from Mitzrayim, previously Eretz Yisrael. That was the primary story that the Qasim said. Each one, many stiris, meaning if you wanted to have Edim, it would not survive a minute of Drishas v'Chakiris. But there's some sort of narrative that comes through from what they're trying to say over there. Okay, so now enters the Shail and the Psakim. Now, what's interesting is like this. The Ethiopians, when they came to Eretz Yisrael, originally, like we said last week, were all having Geirus l'Chumra. Everybody was having Geirus l'Chumra, a new Kabbalas Mitzvahs, a new Tefillah. They were doing that. They were even doing Hatafas Dam Bris. A real Geirus l'Chumra with all the pitchivkis. Now, eventually, when thousands of them came in one shot, some of them developed this backbone where they said this is a bezayin to our heritage, to treat us like we're second-class citizens. We're no different than if you'd be Shevet Reuven and we'd be Shevet Dan. And don't mandate that we should have to, commit to your standards and do a Geirus l'Chumra. We're not asking to do it. That was their position that they took. Now, I want to go into the different Pskim's reaction to that position, Kilo, and that's where the Machlekes tells us. It's a Machlekes in the 1980s, and how the Pskim reacted to that position. Now, I just want to point out one Nakud, and this is Eliezer points this out, and Ramosha points this out as well. There's really two different shilas that need to be done by the Ethiopians' kashrus. Shilah number one is, are they Jews? Period. When someone comes and says, I'm a Jew, is he Neman, is he not Neman, are you a Jew? Shilah number two is, if you are a Jew, naniach that you are a Jew, but being that you were separated from the Kehillah of Jews for so long, and you clearly are not Bekiyim in Hilchas Gittin and Hilchas Kedushin and all the rest of the dinim that are relevant to Mamzerus, there could be a very prevalent Mamzerus shilas that arose in your community that you knew nothing about, and by now the whole community could be riddled with Mamzerim, and even if you were at some point a Jew, and you are still a Jew, and you're Mechuyev in mitzvahs, and I'm Mechuyev to give you tzedakah, and I have a din of a haftal recha kamecha and everything else, I'm still not allowed to marry you, I'm not allowed to treat you like a Jew in good standing. These are two different questions. Now what the interesting thing is, that these things are the inverse of each other. Meaning, the Tzitz Eliezer points this out, and it's very true. He says, you think that I'm knocking you by saying you're not a Jew. Right? You want to be a Jew. Why should I do a Geirus l'Chumra? I'm not a Jew. I'm a Jew. I'm in good standing. Why are you making me do a Geirus l'Chumra? Says Tzitz Eliezer, I'm doing you a favor. If I treat you like you were always a Jew, then you're a mamzer. And then there's nothing I can do to fix you. But if I treat you like you were never a Jew, and really you're just mitchashek to be a Jew, and you're being meisei nefesh and Yiddishkeit, and I'm willing to suspend some of the extra chumras that's around gerus and allow you in with like an easier open welcome, I'm doing you a favor. Because now I don't have to be concerned about your mamzer shaylas, and you can have a gerus with kabbalas mitzvahs, hatafas dambris, and you're good to go. And if I'm machmer on you, and I say, if I'm makel on you in your mind, and I say you really were a Jew all along, then I have to be machmer on your mamzer status, and I have to say what happened to the mamzer thing. That's what the Tzitz Eliezer points out. So now, let's just chart a little bit the different Psakim gishot to this discussion over here. So Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, we started with him last week. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef is the original welcomer of Ethiopian Jewry. Even before he paskin that they're Jews, and even before he paskin that they don't need a gerus l'chumra, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef in the early 1973, when the first original batches of Ethiopians were showing up, Rabbi Ovadia said like this. Rabbi Ovadia said, "It's zichur to me." He says, "I'm being saimach on the Radvaz's tshuva that says that these are Jews who stam from Shevet Dan, and since these are Jews who stam from Shevet Dan, I'm willing to consider them Jews." He says, and with all the dinim of a haftar kamoicha and v'cheyachicha imach, and saving them and rescuing them, and since they find themselves in a precarious situation where they are, there's a civil war in Sudan, they find themselves in a very precarious situation, they're being near, they're being killed, it's incumbent on us, Klal Yisrael, the rest of the body of Klal Yisrael, to reach out and to embrace them and bring them in and try to bring them and welcome them in. This is what Rabbi said. And based on this psak, the Israeli government, paskin, that the law of return and the rule that Israel is supposed to welcome, all the huddled masses of Jews throughout the world applies to them, and you have to bring them in and welcome them in. Now, I just want to read you something, and this is important to keep in mind. In his first tshuva, Rabbi Ovadia writes like this. He says, "V'chalila," this is prat number 2, he sticks in at the end of the tshuva. He says, "V'chalila levatel atakana shel ger l'chumra." But this is in 1973. Chalila to be mevatel the rule of gerus l'chumra. B'bchinas v'altasik v'loilim asher gavlu rishonim. He says, "B'bchinas, don't be pirates together in a rule that there is rishonim made." Shal yidei kein yechalekam l'machanos l'ni nisum imafalashim. Now this was very prescient that Rabbi wrote over here. He didn't end up staying with this, but what he says over here is absolutely true. He says what's going to end up happening is there's going to be Kehilas and Klal Yisrael that are going to say we marry with these people, and there's going to be Kehilas and Klal Yisrael that say no, we don't. These are off limits. We don't marry these people. So you're going to end up splitting Klal Yisrael into who they marry, who they don't marry. You're going to make a period in Klal Yisrael in a way that's never supposed to be. He says, and then he continues, fine. This is where he ends off. Now, basically, Rav Ovadia in his early tshuvas, even though he considered them Jews, and he was welcoming of them and warmly embracing them and welcoming them to Eretz Yisrael, he does clearly say that there's no way to be mevatel on this takana of gerus l'chumra. This is what Rav Ovadia says. Now, he gives 2 reasons. One is because of altasik v'ul rishayim, and one is because you don't want to make pirud. You don't want to make a situation in Klal Yisrael where some Jews will marry them and some Jews won't marry them. Now, in 1984, they start coming in mass, and they start protesting outside the Rabbanut and demanding that they should be treated equally. They start using a little bit the terms of racism, that it's just because of the way they look different that we don't want them here, and that's why you're not welcoming them. And they start demanding that the Rabbanut relax its standards and not demand the gerus of them. Now, I want to read you. So basically, the Rabbanut, the Rabbi Ovadia was not the chief rabbi anymore. The chief rabbi at that time was Rav Mordechai Eliyahu, was the Sephardic chief rabbi, and the Ashkenazi chief rabbi was Rav Avram Shapira, the Rashiv of Merkaz Harav. These were the chief rabbis who originally also were anti-allowing them to come in without gerus l'chumra, but under tremendous pressure from these protests, and also under pressure from the previous Rabbanim Harashim, from the previous chief rabbis. Because Rav Ovadia in 1984 put out a tshuva, a monumental tshuva, a consequential tshuva. Rav Ovadia says that I'm walking back this that I said that they need a gerus l'chumra, and he explained himself as follows. He says, all along, I was always convinced, be'ikr, that we hold like the Radvaz. That these are considered good Jews in good standing. And Rav Asi says, I wanted to be deferential to the Psakim of the earlier Psakim, like Rav Herzog, and like Israel Hildesheimer, and other Psakim. So out of my desire to be deferential to them, I stuck to a gerus l'chumra. I said, what does it cost you? There's no big isnagdus. Just do a gerus l'chumra. It's not a big deal. But now that I see that they're terribly, taken by this, and this is a real bizayon for them, and they really don't want to do a gerus l'chumra, so I'm going to say that I didn't hold like the Radvaz and his Talmud the Merikash, and I'm going to be semach on that to say that we don't need a gerus l'chumra at all. And not that you don't need a gerus l'chumra at all, we don't need a gerus l'chumra fully, and he took away the hatafas dam bris. It seems that was the main primary thing that was triggering them. Just to do a dip in the mikveh or to say I'm a kabul all the mitzvahs kedas Moshe, big deal. That's not a big deal. They were happy to do that. But the Hatafas Dam Bris he took away and he allowed them to relax those standards. And based on this psak, Rav Goren went even further. Rav Goren said they don't need anything. They're Jews. L'chatchila, it was a bigger chazar even. But based on this pressure from the street and pressure from the previous Rabbanim and Rashiyim, the Rabbanut changed its stance and said that no longer do they need this full Geras L'chumra. It's a much more relaxed Geras L'chumra that they need, and with this they could be welcome. Now, Rabbi Vadi was incredibly correct with what he said in his first tshuva in 1973, that it would lead to a period where some Jews won't accept it and some Jews will accept it. That was definitely a very good nevuah on what would happen with such an outcome. Now, I want to read you. Reb Moshe is famous to have written several tshuvas about this, and I want to get to them. Reb Moshe wrote 2 tshuvas about this, but there's actually a little, I wouldn't call it a tshuva, but a little letter that Rav Shach wrote that really has in it every detail of the way that that people looked at this. He writes like this. He says, "Kifi miyat yidiyasi," very humble. He says, with the little bit that I know. He says, "V'gam kol yamei gadalti ben hachachamim gedolei atayr v'yira." My whole entire life I spent amongst kaisei yeshivas with gedolim v'chachamim. V'lo yadati, he says, v'lo shamati me'elam, I never knew of or never heard of sheyesh b'dinei issa v'heter inyan shel pshara. I never heard that when it comes to a shaila, an issa v'heter shaila, there's an inyan of pshara. You can make a pshara. Like, okay, you really want something, I really want something. It's a shaila, if it's us or it's mutter, we'll make a pshara, he says. Mitoch lachatzim me'ela anoigim b'davar. Especially from pressures from those who are negei b'davar, who have a vested interest in the case. Umimishu dinei yisavatim mefurashim b'shulchan aruch. Says dinei yisavatim mefurashim b'shulchan aruch. Shekol am Yisrael nag al pi mashim mefurashim b'shulchan aruch. There was a ubiquity. All of Klal Yisrael is noeg in dinei yisavatim, like what it says in the Shulchan Aruch. V'leinitna rishos l'shum rav yichidi. There's no permission given to one individual rav, ay rabbanut lintoit mimenu, or the whole rabbanut, to be perished from what it says in Shulchan Aruch. Included in this is all the dinei geris, which are explicit in all of their dinim. Any rav who's meira wants to make it with that geris. Woe is to us that this came in our days. And this is just the beginning of a slippery slope to be matter on all different isurim because of lachatz. If you get pressures, then you can be makel about stuff. Every Rav should starve with me for a macha. This is what I feel is my responsibility to make a macha begaloi. Now, this was in the Ater, I believe. This kol kaira that Rav Shach put out on his own. In the Hamodia, actually, Rav Moshe put out a small kol kaira, shorter, 3 lines. Rav Moshe wrote as follows like this: Kivin shenisayir mechadash advar falashis. The shaila came up again. I already wrote my opinion in several tshuvas, and I want to read those soon. That you mechuyev to be megayer them at the tafas dam bris. V'tfila v'kabbalas al mitzvahs kedas Moshe v'Yisrael v'ein makom l'psharas b'zeh. There's no makom for a pshara over here. This is Rav Moshe. It's Rav Moshe. Again, it's very indicative of each person's perspective and how they talk in general. Meaning, if you're familiar with the way Rav Moshe talks, the way Rav Shach talks, but they're both conveying the same thing. Rav Moshe saying it in one line, Rav Shach saying it in a paragraph. That it's unheard of to make a pshara. B'dinei yisrael v'heter. It's a dinei yisrael v'heter. It doesn't yikav adinei sahar. Meaning there's nothing to do. I know that it's uncomfortable. I know it's not kashmak. I know it feels racist. But there's nothing we could do to change the mitzias of a psak. And later on, Rav Shach put together a kol kaira that was Rabbi Yashiv signed on, Rav Shem Zalman signed on, and several more rabbanim, where it said hinenu bezel lohidia ki al pi halacha k'vi shenagu b'artzeinu hakadosh me'azim mitamid. Hafalashim abam Ethiopia hinam b'chlal Safek Yehudim. They have the gather of Safek Yehudim. V'tzrichim lavar gir b'din. They have to have a regular geirus kedin. Dahainu kabbalas mitzvahs hatafas dam bris v'tfila. Ve'ein la'af echad l'shanis hadavar. This is a kol kaira that they put out. So the rabbanim who we call our leaders, who are the leadership of the Charedish Kehillah in Eretz Yisrael from that whole world, came out very, very strong and said there's no makom pshara, you have to stick to it, there's nothing to do about it. Now, Reb Moshe wrote 2 tshuvas about this, and I want to read you them if I could find them, where he actually addresses all the different details. Reb Moshe, in his first tshuva, he writes, is even before this whole, before everybody came up, before the whole tremendous aliyah, before the fighting, before the protest, before the backtrack. Reb Moshe is writing just on a blank slate. Reb Moshe writes as follows. He said, I looked into this sugya falashis, and he says, Yodua mashakasa b'shut Radvaz chilik shvi. It's Yodua what the Radvaz writes, meaning Ravadia was Saimach on that. It's Yodua what the Radvaz writes in his tshuva, shemashmi midvar shemachzikim ki Yehudim. Says Reb Moshe, and this is fascinating because the Radvaz is a pasuk from. The Radvaz lived in the 1500s. It's 400 or 500 years before Reb Moshe. Says Reb Moshe as follows: Of a ledina lahalacha. Reb Moshe says, bottom line, shura tachtona lahalacha kashelis mechalzeh. It's very hard to be saimach on this tshuva from the Radvaz. Shlei barer Radvaz yad the hate of hametzias eidaisam. it's not really clear to me that the Radvaz knew the real Metzias about these people. This is Ramesha talking. And even in Tim Salem, the Radvaz was right, and he knew exactly the pratim what was going on then. But how do you know nothing changed till now? Avaladina, he says, Einam be'isr mamzerus. You don't have to be cheshiv in your mamzerus. Whatever, and he brings. Now again, this is the duality that we pointed out before. Vivait, you're not so cheshish that they're Jews, you're not so cheshish that they're mamzerim. It goes together. Ramesh is not so worried that they're mamzerim, he's worried that they're not Jews. It says, L'gabi yahadusam nechshav lanu kesafik, it's called a suffik. They need to have an actual proper gerus before they can be mutter to come to the kahal. Avagam kaidim gerusam, and here's where you see the softer side. He says, Yesh mishvala atzilam mishmad misakana zikr. You should treat them like Jews. L'gabi chesed and raf l'reich kamecha and hatzala. Save them, treat them, even coddle them, even try to welcome them warmly. He says, shesafik nefashis l'hakol. Because in regard to the din of nefashis, zikr have to be mekel. Gam shekana safik have v'etzem yichusam ki Yehudim. Okay, then he says, he says, but don't make an earlift and bring them if they're not going to be maskim. Now there's so many like ke'ein nevuas that are in these chuvas. Ravadi's chuvah, Moshe's chuvah, he says, don't bring them to Yisrael if they're going to make a fuss about gerus, because to bring them and they're not going to be gerim, that's just going to be mamzer, make more hisbolus in Eretz Yisrael. You're bringing more goyim into Eretz Yisrael for Jews who don't really care about these things to marry and to have more shilas and more shilas. Don't bring them if they're not going to be maskim to Megayer, he says. Fine. Then he says, you have to help them and everything. Okay, and then at the end of it he says, the Pashat Yesh Lekarvam, it doesn't matter what color they are. This is what Moshe writes in the Tshuva. It doesn't matter that they're not the same color as you. You have to save them anyhow. Potentially they could be Vafta Mesager. So Moshe says very much, welcome them warmly, care for them, only bring them if they're going to be masculine to be Megayer, but welcome them, care for them, give them money, treat them well, and try to get them along the track to have gerus. V'asayim b'tikva, that the matzav should get better. B'schos shmiras kol ha-mitzvahs niske kolana b'kir l'kibutz galei say the Mashiach tzidkenu. And this is again a very straightforward hashkafa. Moshe is saying is b'schos the kiyum of the mitzvahs, even if it seems difficult and it seems like it's going to be contentious. B'schos the kiyum of the mitzvahs is how we're going to get to a real geula shlema. Now, this is Moshe's first tshuva. Moshe's second tshuva, he was aware of all the hack already. The thousands more had come. The fight if they should be Megayer, they shouldn't be Megayer had already arisen. The chazar of the Rabbanot, the different psak, and I don't have time to read the whole thing, but Moshe's Einikel, and we have the Shaila and the Tshuva. Moshe's Einikel wrote him a Shaila with all the details, the politics on the ground. It's like a 2-page Shaila with all the politics on the ground, all the people that are involved, and really what he was bavarning is that it's Yidua, anyone who knows Moshe's style, Moshe would not get involved in political zach in Eretz Yisrael. Moshe held that they have their own Gedolim, it's not his department to weigh in to Hanhaga Shailas in Eretz Yisrael. A Shaila, pure, stripped down halacha Shaila, Moshe would always answer. But on Haga Shaila he stayed away from. Now, at this point, this question had gone from being a stripped-down halacha shaila, a basic, straightforward halacha shaila, to being a very political hanhaga shaila of Eretz Yisrael that was mamish intertwined with how do you look at the Rabbanot, how do you treat the Rabbanot, what's their ability to be kaveh policy, and etc. Moshe was very much wanted to stay away from it. So Zeinkel writes him a whole long tshuva, and then he writes as follows. He says, I got the tshuva, he says, it's very hard for me to write, I'll have it transcribed. This is Kebekesher la falashas, he says. Traditionally, I stay away from things that are negeya to the Rabbanim in Eretz Yisrael. It's their department, it's not my department. Your shaila f'chinuch atzmai, in the letter he writes, the shailas of chinuch atzmai should take them into the schools so that they will eventually become gerim. Meaning, even if they're protesting geirus now, so there were those who felt the only way to get them to come around eventually is to bring them to a meisid that teaches Torah. They'll understand what they're missing, and then they'll become gerim. He says that's an internal question in the governing body of chinuch atzmai, which is the Israeli Rabbanim Sugya, their department. I'm not so involved in that. In the core halachic question of what is the status of these Jews, that I can answer you, he says. He says, he says, since they were not neschanach with chinuch dati, they're just going to become worse and worse. They're never going to want to be megayer, and this could cause this bailus. He said, he says, so this is his first question. Fine, I'm sorry, 1 second. There's no chash teaching Torah to them. But adshim is gairim until they actually become gairim. He says, "Ein lachshivam l'maisik Yehudim v'adoyim." You cannot treat them like vada Yehudim. Afilu b'keshel tzirif l'minyan or l'kabel liyas l'teira. Even like have basic things like tzirif l'minyan and getting an aliyah. He says, "Ein levaisham." Don't embarrass them. Avl ein lachnifam. That's such a great line. Like that's the posture over here. Ein levaisham, of course, try to be warm, try to teach them, try to welcome them, try to convince them to go where they need to get to in order to be full-fledged, citizens of the nation of Klal Yisrael. Ein levaisham, aval ein la'achnifam. You can't be machnif them. You can't just say, yeah, because you want me to tell you that you're a Jew, I'm going to agree that you're a Jew. That's what Moshe writes. But them, if you know an Ethiopian who wants to be from, even before his Geirus, he has to keep all the mitzvahs because he's a Safek Yehudi, he's a Safek Jew. Because maybe they're still Jews. So this is Rav Moshe, and it very much mirrors what the Rabbi Yashiv and Rav Shlomo Zalman and Rav Shach and this Kol Kaira were saying, and Rav Moshe himself put out his own Kol Kaira. And this became the pasture of the Charedish Rabbanim Eretz Yisrael. Now what this led to was, even till today, you can see Moshe Steinbach has a much more recent tshuva about it, where this is still relevant, and others have recent tshuvas about it. What it led to is this exact thing that Rav Adi was warning about, is that you're going to end up having a whole kehila, a whole kfutza of Klal Yisrael, that some people consider Jews, some people don't consider Jews, and it's amongst the Klal Yisrael themselves that there's no consensus on how to look at these people. And this is what happened. And Memela, because of that, the Ethiopian kehila became, not just because of this, because of the way the Rabbanim looked at it, and because of the way the state put them in certain areas, the Ethiopian kehila became more turned upon themselves, meaning they grew and grew on their own, but they do look at themselves as an independent body from the Israeli, populace, Sai Haredi and Sai otherwise. For example, there was a protest the Ethiopians had, I forgot what year it's in, when there was Eritrean refugees, from Eritrea in Africa, in the middle of a civil war, and Israel was not allowing unlimited Eritrean refugees into the country. The Ethiopians protested that it's racist that Israel won't let the Eritreans in. Meaning their identity and their loyalty was, in a certain sense, more connected to the other African landsmen than it was to the Israeli state, which just shows you that the Israeli state was not matzliach in integrating them into the state and being from a halachic perspective, because, in a certain way, because the Rabbanut backtracked and gave them the easy way out, so to speak, and said, okay, you really don't want to have Geras L'Chumra, so we'll go easy on you. Because of the backtrack, we'll go easy on you. That made that people who were not willing to backtrack were never able to commit to really welcoming them, which just leads to this stalemate, where as they developed and the rest of the community developed, West of Israel developed, it split into these two things. Just saying, Rav Adia's comment in 1973 was very prescient and very true. It just didn't end up, he wasn't, the Rabbanot and Rav Adia himself didn't hold the line long enough for it to maybe see it to the end. Now, there is another shayla that's relevant to this. I don't think we're going to have time to go into it. I'll just open it up. It's just a shayla that needs discussing. Is Bechlal, when it comes to, like this, a question. Shulchan Aruch is available on the shelf, right? Anybody could go learn it, and you could have a guy who lives in Wichita or Kansas, but who has a Shulchan Aruch, and today he has a Yitzhak Chachma, who could be a gargantuan Talmud Chacham, could be a Talmud Chacham on the highest level. Mamish could know everything, right? But are there certain shaylas that it doesn't matter how big of a Talmud Chacham you are, the psak has to come from the Gedolei Hadar, the leadership, the consensus of the leaders of Klal Yisrael? I'm not saying in Hanhaga. I'm not talking about leading, who should decide if Chinuch Hatzmai takes X, Y, or Z. That, for statement, it's going to come from people who are on the ground. Ein Miman and Bezdin, only someone who has real world experience. And there's many Gemaras in Sanhedrin that are mashma like that. But in pure halacha, in pure psak, is there such a thing as there's a psak that you know everything, you're a big Talmud Chacham, you're a great person, but this is not a psak you can make. This is only a psak that the consensus of rabbinic leadership has to make. Is there such a thing? Now, a lot of what this discussion hinges on is this discussion. Could any one Rav or any sever Rabbanim, as big as they may be, as a kilu undisputed Talmidei Chachamim, grace Talmidei Chachamim, make psakim that are going to upend the whole apple cart, that are going to make these different kfutzas and Klal Yisrael that are not going to be accepted by everybody? Or do you say a psak like this needs to have consensus? You have to gather together, a few Chassidish Rabbanim, a few Litvish Rabbanim, a few Sfaradi Rabbanim, get together, have a Moshe Bezdin, an ad hoc Moshe Bezdin, come to consensus, and then this psak could be. Now this is a grace shayla. It's a philosophical question, but it was also been discussed many times in different Psakim. I'll leave it for today as a thought experiment. Perhaps one day we'll come back to this. There's what to talk about.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.